Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webcast, The Do's and Don'ts of Recovering Active Directory from a Scorched Earth Disaster. This webcast is sponsored by Semperis, and I'd like to welcome you all. I'd also like to share a little bit about our sponsor. Semperis is the pioneer of identity-driven cyber resilience for cross-cloud and hybrid environments. The company provides cyber preparedness, incident response, and disaster recovery solutions for enterprise directory services, also known as the keys to the kingdom. Semperis' patented technology for Microsoft Active Directory protects over 40 million identities from cyber attacks, data breaches, and operational errors. Now I'd like to cover a few housekeeping details. We'll be hosting a Q&A session after the presentation, and we encourage everyone to participate. So please get ready and submit your questions, and we'll have our speakers here answer as many as we can. Semperis has provided a number of resources, and you can find them in the Resource tab. So please take a moment and check them all out. This webcast is being recorded and will be available for replay, and you'll receive an email when the replay is available, and that should be in approximately 24 to 48 hours. And now I'd like to pass the event over to Gil Kirkpatrick, Chief Architect at Semperis. Welcome, Gil. We're so glad you could join us. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, Tracy. Even as recently as 5 or 6 years ago, we didn't worry too much about recovering Active Directory from some sort of enterprise-wide disaster. Our biggest Active Directory concerns were things like somebody driving a backhoe over the internet fiber, some sort of electrical problem in the data center, a tornado or a hurricane, or somebody fat-fingering an OU and needing to recover that. The scope of the threat that we used to typically worry about was very localized. It would be a server or a rack or a data center. And Active Directory was architected for that threat. And it's proven very resilient. If you lose a DC, it's no big deal. Everything keeps working. A data center goes dark. All the other sites continue to run. Probably the worst case scenario we worried about would be some sort of a schema update failure that would corrupt all of the domain controllers. And that was sort of a theoretical possibility, but it wasn't one that anybody took very seriously. The likelihood of needing to recover your entire Active Directory from a backup was pretty much nil. If you fast forward to 2020 now with the rise of ransomware and wiperware attacks, the risk picture is entirely different. It's really the external threat from criminal organizations that we have to worry about, using prepackaged malware tools and even malware as a service that can wipe out everything connected to your network in just minutes. More and more criminals are targeting Active Directory, both for surveillance, for lateral movement inside the enterprise, and as an asset itself that can be held for ransom. Instead of taking a DC offline or accidentally deleting an OU, we now have to worry about every single computer on the network just being wiped out. Ransomware and recovering Active Directory from scratch have become topics even at the board level. The threat model for AD has changed, and our approach to Active Directory disaster recovery has to change as well. So my name is Gil Kirkpatrick. I'm the Chief Architect at Semperis. I've been a Microsoft MVP for directory services and enterprise mobility for the last 15 years. I wrote the original book on Active Directory programming, and I was the host for the Directory Experts Conference, which is a well-regarded technology conference for people specializing in Microsoft identities. And I'd like to introduce my colleague today, Guido Grillenmeier. Guido and I have worked together for, it seems like nearly 20 years, and we've spent quite a bit of time on Active Directory disaster recovery. Guido, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks for that, Gil. Absolutely, and what those 20 years have been like. It's been very special, and it's my pleasure to participate here in this session. My name is Guido Grillenmeier, and I'm a Chief Technologist at DXC Technology, and I've also been a Microsoft MVP for Directory Services for many years. Not sure if it's a good thing or bad thing, but I've had my own share of Active Directory disasters with various customer engagement and helping them to get out of that mess. And I'm happy to share some of that experience with all of you here on the call today.
Great. So let me start out with some statistics on ransomware and wiperware attacks. And it's not really a happy picture. In 2019, the number of attacks increased more than 100% over 2018, and in 2020, it looks like it's increasing even faster. Most of the increase in attacks in 2020 have been in the healthcare space, as well as state and local government and small enterprises. A week doesn't go by that you don't hear about some sort of ransomware attack on some organization. A recent statistic is that a business suffers some sort of ransomware attack nearly every 40 seconds. And that's really hard to get your head around, that these attacks are happening so frequently. And the total cost is running into the many billions of dollars. It's projected to hit between 16 and $20 billion in the next couple of years. And just recently, in the last, I'd say 2 or 3 months, more and more what we're hearing is that a company will be hit by ransomware, recover from it, either by recovering their environment themselves or by paying the ransom, and then being attacked again within the next week or two. And that can be either the same criminal organization attacking them with the same software, or it might be a different organization with different malware who target them explicitly because they know that their defenses are pretty weak. So the whole situation is just pretty miserable, and it's costing people lots of time and lots of money. And it's something that we need to consider about how we actually prepare ourselves for this kind of disaster. So one of the poster children for ransomware attacks is the shipping company Maersk. I'm sure you've seen their containers on the highway or their ships in the harbor. A couple of years ago, I guess it's about 3 years ago now, they suffered an attack by the NotPetya wiperware tools, and it ended up costing them overall more than $350 million. That's what they acknowledged publicly. I've heard estimates that it actually cost them almost double that. The management at Maersk Shipping have been very forthcoming about the attack itself and their response to it. And if you have a chance, you should read the article by Andy Greenberg. Andy Greenberg's an author for Wired magazine, and he wrote a really good, detailed article about how the attack happened and how ultimately over time Maersk was able to deal with it. And he spent quite a bit of time on their Active Directory and how they recovered that. And Andy has also written a book called Sandworm, which I recommend. We've partnered with Andy on a conference, which I'll tell you about a little bit later. And we can make a copy of the book Sandworm available to you, and I'll give you some details at the end of the talk about how you can get that. So Guido, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about the Maersk disaster?
Absolutely, and you're right about the 3 years. It's going to have sort of its anniversary on June 27th. The 3-year anniversary was in 2017 that this attack basically occurred. And let's be clear, we're talking here mainly about Maersk, but Maersk was actually not the target of the hackers, not the specified target. The NotPetya attack was attributed to Russian military hackers by lots of fine and detailed analysis of sources of the code of the actual malware used. And most of us will be aware that that happened at that time. It was in the news, it was everywhere, but not necessarily what a nightmare it was and how did it actually act out. And so we wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of that. So those military hackers, they basically had one particular company that they attacked, a Ukraine company, an accounting software company where they placed a bug through your classic front door mechanisms, email, phishing attack, some code in a file. It's this way that malware often reaches its target. And that target was then put on the servers that basically ran that Ukraine software business in this accounting software, like you have it for your Quick and for other software that you might be using in your business for tax work and what else. It would update its customers' systems periodically to actually update them with normal code. And that code was then infected and spread around the globe. Of course, Ukraine companies were hit the most, but the other companies are the ones like Maersk that worked with this software in their Ukrainian subsidiary. Yeah? And here, to propagate the tools, actually used, let's say, attack tools, penetration tools that originated from the NSA, Eternal Blue Code, yeah, that then used classic reading tools to get passwords from RAM minicats in this case, that would look on clients that it could reach to see cache credentials in memory, actually reading them from RAM, and then getting increased permissions in the environment, elevating themselves up to administrator level. And in the Maersk case, that included administrative access to domain controllers, where in the end, not only the domain controllers, but also plenty of thousands of PCs of that environment and servers were basically filled with or had a payload to kill this payload that eventually wiped that master file table of the clients. And if you have that on all of your systems, you can imagine what happens. And in this case, it was basically all the domain controllers that the virus could reach also was taken down. And now think about the consequences. It's, in this case for Maersk, it's even the shipping gates were affected. It's a beautiful picture that we're showing here of ships in the harbor with all those containers. They have to be moved somewhere, from a warehouse to the ships or from the ships to a warehouse. And Maersk, as such a large provider, have their own pieces in the harbor protected by gates that they would open and close for the truck drivers to either pick up or deliver those containers. That gate was protected by, guess what, a PC that was infected, or even where a person would just need to authenticate to then use the control software to open the gate. That wasn't possible. So they indeed had a direct impact to basically their whole delivery line, and Maersk customers were also impacted. That's why a lot of the payments and the cost of that event wasn't just the IT side of things, but also, of course, damage control and damage payments to the customers of Maersk.
I think one of the interesting things to stress here is that Maersk wasn't the target of the attack. They were sort of an innocent bystander, and even though they weren't the target, they suffered perhaps the worst results of any of the organizations that had that particular ransomware. And the way that they use Active Directory to control their physical access as well as all of their software systems really increases the risk associated with Active Directory being disabled.
Absolutely, and we wanted to give you some examples of that Active Directory does have that term keys to the kingdom for a good reason, because it's integrated into plenty of applications that you use for your business. Of course, Windows servers, domain joined clients, even Linux clients that you might have integrated with Active Directory for authentication purposes. Your whole collaboration be it mail, be it link or Skype to communicate, has been more and more integrated into Active Directory over the last decade, so that what might have been a lesser impact a decade ago has, of course, increased through the increase of integration with your on-prem AD. Now, you are hopefully also already making the move to the cloud. So this is not just about on-prem dependencies, and it's not just about phones that even need to authenticate through your Skype system, as an example, if you've integrated them back to Active Directory. It's also, of course, about you utilizing cloud services. Think of AWS or Azure Active Directory for your Office 365 services, now called Microsoft 365. You're basically, depending on the setup that you have, you might have chosen a setup that uses federation services, especially in the Azure case. There's an example that if you did have federation services, that to actually log on to your OneDrive or OWA Mail, whatever remote application that would be Azure integrated might be, if you federated that through a mechanism that then first needs to authenticate back to your on-prem AD, that is again a dependency that that we need to be aware of in terms of impact and overall, let's say, targets if Active Directory itself were indeed completely down as it was for Maersk. Gil, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, so one of the things I'd like to say there is that our first recommendation here is understand all the dependencies on Active Directory. That has a couple of consequences. One is you can then model your risks much more effectively if you understand everything else that's depending on Active Directory. And it also helps organize your disaster recovery plans so that you know how to sequence the recovery of different applications after you've recovered your Active Directory.
Absolutely.
So, and go ahead. I'm sorry, Guido.
No worries. I'm just wanting to make the point on this next slide, as lovely as it is, and I really like the picture that we've chosen here. It's provocative on purpose. It's really hard. You cannot easily work without your on-prem AD in such a setup that we've just described. You cannot have a duplicate identity control in your environment, identity provider in your environment that replaces your Active Directory that you shouldn't exclusively rely on. That's not the message that we want to give you. However, think about those dependencies that we've just talked about. Example, Azure services and federation. If you were to choose to sync your AD passwords, actually just the password hashes, into AAD with your AAD Connect sync modules, you basically reduce the dependency of your on-prem Active Directory for those Azure authentication services. Yeah, that would allow you, in such an example that your local AD really does have an availability issue, or your federation services is impacted and they have an availability issue, that you could still reach your cloud resources. You would, of course, still be impacted to reach your on-prem resources, but depending on your setup, that might still allow you to survive one way or another. For email, even Skype and Teams could be utilized to communicate, continue that collaboration with your customers. Another example where that branch might be cut off is Active Directory is not available at all, is you are often in a situation today that you no longer have physical domain controllers. They're all virtualized. And now picture your virtualization operators, be it Hyper-V, be it ESX, most often they actually authenticate your delegation of the permissions in that environment is set up that they authenticate against AD to actually get to vCenter, to actually get to your Hyper-V console or even Zen server, whatever you have in your environment. So Active Directory integration even goes down to the ILO cards of your servers these days, because it is better to have a centrally controlled mechanism, centrally controlled objects to authenticate. There's no doubt about that. We're not making any other points here. But in the case of a disaster, you simply want to be ready that you can still operate your virtualization environment. That might come in very handy during the recovery procedures to actually get to it. Yeah, so you don't want to just saw off that branch. You do need to have some sort of local credentials that you can access, ideally not stored on some password manager that, again, maybe a file on a file server that you cannot reach without authenticating again. So that offline access is becomes important in such scenarios. And let me just add that that also goes for your documentation for the recovery procedures. I've had that situation in the past. That's why I'm never afraid to repeat it, where the customer had it all stored in, well, in that case, that was a public folder in Exchange, be it a SharePoint today, be it Team site, whatever it is tomorrow. If you don't have it offline, then you might struggle to get to it. So that's another situation where in one of those cases, I was simply able to help the customer because I still had a local copy of our recovery procedures, and then we went on with that.
So that brings us to our next recommendation. Keep some of your backups offline. So if you look at the Maersk disaster, one of the things that happened is, along with losing 40,000 PCs and 4,000 servers and all of their domain controllers, they lost all of their backups as well, because their backups were stored online on domain-joined servers. The fact that they were able to recover their Active Directory at all was just pure luck, because they had a remote office in, I think it was Ghana, that had a power failure, and they had one domain controller that was offline at the time of the attack, and they were able to locate it and send somebody down to fetch the disks out of that server and bring them back to London, and they were able to recover ultimately their Active Directory from that one offline domain controller. Another MVP colleague I talked to last week has actually just finished up, or is in the process of finishing up, 2 separate ransomware recoveries, both of them involving tens and hundreds of DCs. And in both cases, the backups for their Active Directory and their critical applications were sitting on domain-joined servers, and they ended up being encrypted as well. So it's really, really critical that you have some way to store your backups offline. Most of the Mimikatz software, Mimikatz-based malware that these things rely on will harvest credentials off of domain-joined machines. So if you can save your backups on a non-domain-joined server, that's a good start. But even beyond that, you can do things like carve off a piece of a SAN and copy your backups to that and keep it offline when it's not being actually accessed. You can also script or use some third-party tools to copy your backup images to Azure or AWS blob storage. It's encrypted, and you can either have Microsoft manage the keys, or you can manage the keys yourself. It doesn't really matter, but at least you have a way of storing your backups in a location where the malware can't reach it. In worst cases, you can use something like a removable hard disk or even tape drives and store them in a safe someplace. The point is to get your backups off of your network and into a place where the ransomware can't get to it.
And there's little to add to this statement made by Craig Williams on the NotPetya attack that we've just talked about a little bit. Basically, this was a political message. Yeah? This wasn't a targeted attack at Maersk. It wasn't a targeted attack to other customers that were impacted, but there was a Ukraine company that was used to spread the virus. And yeah, again, read the story. It's highly recommended to understand that better. It's good to know that this is not just anybody making that statement. Craig Williams, you have to understand, is the director of Talos, the outreach team of Cisco that does also help protect customers from such events at the networking level. So moving on.
So next recommendation is to think about how you do your risk modeling. As I said at the beginning of the talk, the threat model has completely changed for Active Directory. Whereas we used to worry about fairly localized failures of domain controllers or even a data center or somebody deleting an OU, today we have to worry about the potential of wiping out all of Active Directory and all of your servers. And the consequences of that are broad and will essentially take your entire IT operation offline. And in terms of probability now, the notion of having a ransomware attack, as I said at the beginning, there's a ransomware attack nearly every 40 seconds right now. So both probability, in terms of probability and impact, defending yourself and having plans to recover from some sort of ransomware or wiperware attack needs to feature really highly in your risk evaluation.
So after maybe scaring you a little bit with the information provided, which is only partially our intention, because it's really just giving you an update of how the situation truly is today. We, of course, wanted to talk through some of those different scenarios that are just very realistic that we do need to prepare on every day when we're talking about Active Directory attack scenarios, or rather also accidental administrative mistakes. Yeah, they're actually the more common type of little disasters. We've got that, like I just mentioned, accidental deletion. We've got the broken domain controller, which, if you so want, is today a non-issue. Sort of depends a bit where that domain controller is located, but it's typically a matter of either restoring something from backup, or it might be faster just to spin up a new machine and replicate your data again. Again, depends on a lot of those details of your environment. But your link speed across the WAN has increased over the past years manyfold. Different if you did do this across satellite links, of course, but broken domain controllers are a non-issue. That's basically what AD is perfectly capable of coping with and basically redirecting you elsewhere. The accidental change of AD attributes is where it starts to get tricky. The deletions is where today, of course, the recycle bin already helps you a lot if you've enabled it. So I still see companies that might have even made the switch to the right forced functional level, but they've not actually updated or activated the recycle bin for the fear of bit size growth or whatever fears they might have. But it is the most practical way outside of other third-party tools that actually does allow you to recover quickly from those quirks of having deleted an object instead of needing to perform first a non-authoritative restore and all of those things that you want to avoid these days from a fast recovery perspective. The accidental change, like I said, is a bit of a different ballpark because you cannot recover it quickly through just the recycle bin. That's just available for truly deleted objects. But of course, there's snapshot technology that also AD domain controller support, that you can bring the DIT or mount a DIT in a previous version and read the data through LDAP calls or your scripts, whatever you've prepared, and then get data from a previous state of the Active Directory back. But it's still quite involved to get changed data back. So for many, it's still a good thing to really understand what data is populating my AD, what are the sources, and can I maybe basically repopulate it at need when it really does come to the situation that you required. And the situation, the samples 4 and 5 of those disasters, recovery of the partition and the real force recovery, they're not that different. Of course, the force recovery is the worst case, but even if you have a full partition, be it a domain or your DNS, if it's AD integrated, broken, which, by the way, does happen through often administrative mistakes, then your impact is large. It's very large. Your scope is tremendous, and you want to practice that in terms of ensuring that you are able to cope with it. Yeah. So moving to the next slide.
So Guido,
do you want to talk to that?
Yeah. So this Guido sort of surprised me with this slide. This is from a presentation that he and I did back in 2006 on Active Directory force recovery, and we actually ran a workshop, a hands-on workshop for people to start with a 2-domain, 4-domain controller Active Directory environment, and then blow it up and recover the whole thing from backup. And what's interesting is the whole process for recovering Active Directory from backup hasn't changed in 15 years. And in fact, I think the biggest improvement in the whole process is that the framework for the instructions is now available on a web page rather than as a downloadable doc file. That's about the only improvements that Microsoft has made to that. The interesting thing about this workshop was that even given a trivially small environment with 4 domain controllers and step-by-step instructions with every single command to run, where to run it, what to expect, roughly, in fact, less than 20% of the people who went through that workshop were actually able to complete a forced recovery from backup the first time. And that is just to stress how complex the process is and how difficult it is to be successful at it, especially if you don't practice.
Exactly, and I think that practicing is the key point here. It's very well documented, but that doesn't mean that it's simple. So Microsoft has done, of course, quite some updates in terms of documenting, helping you to make the right choice of what is the recovery path to take in a particular disaster scenario. And of course, in the past years, virtualization has come very handy in the sense of also AD, Active Directory, supporting it very much. I'll speak to that in a second regarding speeding up the process of actually scaling up the number of domain controllers that once you are in the situation that you've recovered the first one. Yeah. But before that, we need to understand that rough recovery plan that you want to create for yourself, Gil, right?
Yeah. So the thing about the Microsoft documentation is that it's complete, but it basically just describes the overall process. And it's very general in that sense. What you really have to do is start with that as kind of a template and create a step-by-step plan for yourself. And it needs to be completely detailed down to the individual commands that you have to run and which machines you're going to run those commands on. Because when you need to do the forced recovery, it's going to be at the worst possible time. It's going to be at 2 in the morning. You're going to be tired. Your manager or your CIO is going to be calling you every 3 minutes, asking you, when is Active Directory going to be up? It's going to be the worst possible situation, so you don't, at that point, want to try to figure out how to do things. You need to have figured this all out ahead of time. So the recommendation here is create a step-by-step recovery plan all the way down to the command line level with which machines you're going to recover from. The whole thing breaks down into roughly 5 phases. There's the pre-recovery phase where you start your sort of corporate communications plan and establish communications with all the other teams that you need to work with. Shut off all the DCs, figure out which backups you're going to be able to recover from. And one of the challenges there that we have now that wasn't so much of an issue in the past is that it's quite likely that those backups are infected as well. Malware tends to sit in the enterprise for 200-300 days before it's either triggered or someone discovers that it's there. So the likelihood that your backups are infected is pretty substantial. Next step is to build your initial forest from backup, where you recover the first DC in the root domain and then the first DC in each of the other child domains, make sure that they can replicate, and then you clean up all the metadata and verify that the system is working properly. Cleaning up the metadata means getting rid of all the references to all the DCs that don't yet exist. And then from there, you start scaling out, and you do that typically by promoting additional DCs. You can promote them over the network, or you can use install from media, IFM images. That can speed things up a bit. And there's also a place where cloning and copying DCs can help. Once you've got enough DCs that you can start bringing applications online, you communicate with your other teams, and they can start recovering their applications and verifying that they're working properly. And at the end of all this, you're going to have to go through and reset all the credentials. That means reset everybody's passwords, reset the service account passwords, and on, because if you've been compromised, there's a great chance that all of those credentials have now been exfiltrated. And I can't stress this enough, you need to practice this. You have to develop the plan and then set up a test environment on a couple of virtual hosts and start recovering your forest from backup. It's the only way you'll get comfortable with it, and it's the only way that you'll know that your plan actually works.
And at that, the scale out that we've mentioned before itself, utilizing the rapid deployment of virtualized replica DCs, is supported with Active Directory, of course, for a while now. 2012 is our friend here. But that process itself is, again, one to add in your list and practice, because while it is really powerful and allows you to scale up quickly, it's, again, a process that is not simple. Yeah, it'd be one of those that you'd want to go through. You actually, this is exactly the example again with being good with your right teams, the virtualization team. You need to be working with them. Either you have your own virtualization environment, your own host that you host your domain controls because you don't trust anybody else. That's what's the safest way for operating AD. But in most companies, that's not how things are operated. You've got a different team that's responsible for your virtualization hosts, and then you are a customer of them to host your workload. And then, of course, you need to work tightly together with them. You need to practice. What does it mean to clone a machine to actually recreate it from an existing previous created machine? That might not be the classic mechanisms that they use to deploy servers. Yeah, it might be used for clients, but they've not typically done it for servers. And so it's a step that you definitely want to run through. And of course, from an AD perspective, you also want to understand which machine can you use as that source machine. How do you execute that DC clone command to create the DC clone config XML file? That is actually the one that then tells the machine that you would have cloned at boot time that, oh, I'm a cloned machine. First thing I need to do is talk to the PDC, and then it'll give me a name and do whatever. Yeah. So it's something, again, practice. That'll get you there and allow you to actually then do this in the sake of in the case that you do have the disaster to survive.
And one of the most important things about this whole recovery process is that it has to be fast and it has to be reliable, because every minute that your environment is down, it's going to cost you thousands or potentially millions of dollars. Next recommendation here is don't depend on cyber insurance. And this doesn't really help you in the recovery case, but it's something you need to make clear to your management. We talked to an insurance company executive a while ago. They were a sort of well-known supplier of cyber insurance. And we asked them about how they were dealing with a huge increase in claims due to ransomware. And he said, how much do you think we're actually paying out for ransomware attacks? And he said, I have no idea. And he said, basically zero. And the issue was that most of their customers' policies have some clauses in it that relate to their security practices. And the insurance investigators were able to establish that they weren't always following those best practice security practices. So the insurance company didn't have to pay out. Another thing that has happened that I've read about, although I haven't experienced this directly, is that a lot of the malware that people are suffering from is based on sort of weaponized software from Russian hacking groups. And there's a act of war clause that says the insurance company won't pay out in the case of acts of war, and they've been able to successfully claim that this malware was in fact a weapon being used in a wartime scenario. So they didn't pay out in that case. So convince your management that they can't just depend on insurance to take care of things for them. So let me give you a quick overview of how ransomware and wiperware tends to work. There are hundreds of different kinds of malware that can attack your network. This is just sort of an overview. When the malware lands, usually it comes from some sort of spear phishing attack. I think 90% or so of all malware attacks come through some spear phishing email. And the damage starts with actually exercising administrator access to the local machine that the malware ends up on, because the malware often needs to use debug privileges to access credentials in LSAS memory. And the malware will then use those credentials and then issue API calls to other machines on the network, which it typically finds by searching Active Directory, to take advantage of unpatched vulnerabilities in Windows on the network, and also to start looking for other active sessions, to find if they've got higher level credentials, administrative credentials associated with them. Then the malware moves, it harvests those credentials, and then tries to work its way up the chain until ultimately they get domain admin credentials. And then quite often the malware will just sit there until it's triggered by some sort of external event, or when it dials out to some sort of command and control server. And then it will wipe out all the machines that it's running on. And depending on the malware, that might wipe out the disk entirely by encrypting the MFT and essentially brick the server. Or in some cases, it just encrypts all of the data and leaves the executables in some sort of functioning state. The interesting thing about this is that almost all of these activities are things that can be stopped through basic good security practices. So you can eliminate a lot of the risk associated with ransomware and wiperware just by patching your systems. Mostly they rely on propagating through some sort of already known vulnerability, some unpatched vulnerability. Second thing is don't give users administrative access to their machines. I know it's a big pain in the butt, but if users don't have admin access on their local machines, it makes it much harder for the malware to take advantage of that machine and then migrate off to another machine. Third thing, again, basic security practices is make sure you have good passwords. There's something like, 15 or 20 billion sets of credentials that are available on the dark web. So simple passwords are going to be very, very easy to crack. And simple service passwords are subject to things like Kerberoasting, where malware can spoof Kerberos tickets by cracking the simple passwords associated with some services. Also enforce things like later versions of TLS 1.2, 1.3, and to the extent you can, get rid of NTLM, especially NTLM v1 and NTLM v2 authentication.
Yeah, we wanted to give you a few basics that should be standard in the meantime, but it's, again, good to re-emphasize. By the way, I wanted to add that if somebody should be interested to get into let's say the work era of the hacking business, it's really easy these days too, because all of those components that Gail had just described are available like as a software as a service in the darknet. This is of course something that is being monitored, but believe me, you do not need to be a specialist anymore to get that far. And so you as the person responsible for your AD, just operating them with the, let's say, security best practices are already making it much harder for anybody to attack your environment. Use server core, now called the standard way of operating or installing a server. Big deal. Give up the GUI. Do command line. Work with that. Yeah. Use your segmentation of duties. I'm sure you have it set up that your AD admins and also admins of other critical systems in your environment, they have separate accounts for administration versus for their standard office work. Has to be that way. Other work where users are managed, help desk, and wherever else, whatever other groups are delegated permissions in Active Directory. You can take it a step further. It's not easy, but certainly a model that Microsoft has been pushing quite heavily in the past years too, is a tiered AD configuration where you basically have, if you still want, an empty bastion force with just your prestigious, critical administrative accounts that then has a trust back to the force that you basically use for production. And that force would, like the name implies, be your bastion, like a fortress that would be so much harder to get into. And it's those accounts that would be required to actually crack your production environment. And they are protected in a very particular way with very short Kerberos times to refresh, ticket times, etc., etc. So it doesn't loom around in the environment. Yeah. Monitoring, key thing. Ensure that you're doing a good job here. Your cybersecurity teams, I'm sure, are doing their best to monitor logon activity, suspicious logon activity, token bloat. You could have tokens way too large that your users are potentially no longer able to log on, etc. We're just giving a few tips here that think about it. Do the best practice in security. That gets you very far in protecting yourself from disasters.
Yeah, I think one of the things I'd like to add here is that this tiered administration model where administrators with more sensitive, more privileged accounts don't log into lower privileged resources, that goes really, really far to keeping malware from propagating throughout your network. Okay, so I have to recommend this book by Andy Greenberg. I mentioned Andy Greenberg at the top of the session as the author who wrote about the Maersk disaster for Wired magazine. He's written a book called Sandworm, which covers Maersk, but also covers about half a dozen other malware, and ransomware attacks, and in particular looks at the different military-based hacking groups from Russia and Korea and China, and the kind of malware they're producing and the attacks that they've actually performed, some of which you've probably not heard of. It's a really good piece of investigative journalism, and it's a great piece of writing too. I mean, it's maybe not quite Tom Clancy, but it's a worthwhile read. And I'd recommend one that you read it just to get a sense of what it is that you're dealing with respect to malware, and also give it to your management so that they have some perspective now as to the threats that are now the threats that they have to worry about with respect to their own IT organization. We partnered with Andy earlier in the year to put on the Identity Resilience Conference at RSA, and we've worked out a deal with him basically where we can make a copy of his book available. So if you see the URL there on this slide, go ahead and check that out, and we can get you a copy of this book that you can read and provide to your management as well.
And it's for sure no malware that you click when you click on that link.
That's right. I promise. There's no malware on that URL. So I would be remiss in not responding to our marketing department to give at least a shout out to our products. At Semperis, we build products to basically protect your Active Directory and recover your Active Directory from all sorts of cyber disasters. We have a fairly unique cyber first approach to monitoring and recovering Active Directory. And at this year's RSA, we won quite a few awards for both the monitoring tools and the cyber recovery tools for Active Directory. The probably most relevant bit of information for our Active Directory recovery tools is that we have a way of recovering Active Directory without the risk of reintroducing malware, which is now really important because it's so easy to take a backup that you've got, a system state backup or a bare metal recovery backup that's been sitting infected for months, and then when you think you're recovering and building a new clean Active Directory, you in fact are building one that's just being infected again. So please check us out at www.semperis.com. If you have any questions, you can certainly ask me or post something up on our website and somebody will get back to you. So I think we're getting close to the end of our appointed time here. I'd like to ask you if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box there, and we'll do our best to answer them. So Tracy, back to you.
Great. Thank you so much. Great do's and don'ts. I'm sure the audience appreciated them. So yeah, we do have a Q&A session here. We have a short time, but please fill in your questions and we'll get to as many as we can. So the first question is using Azure AD still acceptable for the highest level of security compliance standards?
That's interesting. And Guido, I think I'm going to ask you to respond to this. We were talking about this actually just a few days ago. What's your perspective on Azure?
So Azure AD absolutely is fulfilling the highest security compliance standards. Banks have high compliancy requirements and have made the move into Azure Office 365. That basically means accepting Azure AD, and with that, the security compliance of the system. Azure and also other cloud services have come a long way in terms of being secure. So that answer is a clear yes.
Great.
Okay, very good. Here's another question. How do you know if your AD is clean or infected?
Well, that's a really good question, and the answer is it's very, very hard. Now, AD itself is fundamentally just a database at the end of the day, so it's not so much that the directory itself is going to be infected, but it's very likely that the system binaries on the domain controller are infected. So you've got a couple of approaches. One is if you're recovering from a system state or bare metal recovery backup, you need to convince yourself that that backup is in fact not infected. And you can only do that by running, antivirus tools of various sorts to make sure that it doesn't have any known viruses. The problem is that those are probably the same tools you had running when the infection happened anyway, and you can only hope that they've been updated to reflect maybe newer infections and newer malware. Other approach is to recover from a backup that doesn't include system binaries, and that's the approach that we use at Semperis for our Active Directory forest recovery product. It doesn't recover, it basically allows you to recover Active Directory as a service on a fresh install of Windows, so we don't really store any of the system binaries that might be infected. So those are really the only two approaches there. Yeah, I think that's basically it.
Yeah. We do have an interesting related question, at least somewhat related, on the clonable DCs. Let me take that question, where basically the question is, does cloning a DC assume that nothing else in terms of software is installed on the machine? Otherwise, it seems like you have to take care of all the sysprep preparations of the different software elements. And basically, I guess the key thing is that you should have almost no other software running on your domain controllers. The question might hint at antivirus software and whatnot. And it is indeed a sysprep happening. Of course, this is cloning of the operating system. And if there would be other software that, again, I would avoid putting on the systems right at the time before you clone them. Antivirus software is actually quite well prepared for cloning, so that's maybe the one exception. Maybe even your monitoring agent, if it can handle that. I cannot speak for all of that. But typically it would be a fairly limited version of that source that you would clone and then scale out and then deploy your additional agents of whatever software you want to have on those systems out once they're available. So mostly clean DC with exceptions, but of course no other, business applications or whatnot. They don't belong on domain control at all.
Right. There's another question here. What are the drawbacks of VM snapshot-based recovery of a DC? Well, if all you're recovering if all you have to recover is one DC, there's really no problem with that. The problem comes in when you have multiple DCs that are replicating, and Active Directory is a distributed system that runs across multiple DCs, and the state information that controls the replication process is actually distributed across all of those DCs as well. And if you just snapshot your running DCs, what you end up with is a saved state that is inconsistent, and when you try to recover from that, it will either take a long time to sort out what the replication status really is, or in fact it never will, and you'll end up with deleted objects that are showing up in your global catalog and so forth. So you can't count on just using VM snapshots to recover your AD. The only way you could really do that, I think, is if you shut down all of your DCs, take a snapshot, and then start them all back up again. That way you'd be certain of getting a consistent view of the replication process.
And let me add to that, because I think it's important people hopefully know that snapshotting a domain control in the meantime is supported if you do use a hypervisor. I doubt that you have anything else running that does support the VMGen ID logic, basically helping the domain control itself understand what status it is in and then respond accordingly. So typically that's made to ensure that that machine itself comes back and then replicates from another domain controller that is actually running in a good state, not reverted to a snapshot. But it's not meant to really recover your whole Active Directory back to a particular status. Like Gil just said, that would only really work if you had all of the domain controllers snapshotted at the same machine, which means first shutting them down to have a really clear state. Not typically useful in production. In a test environment, that's actually how I've often also done it. But certainly not for production.
Yep. Okay. Let me see. Tracy, are we sort of at the end of our rope here?
Yeah, we've reached the top of the hour, and so I really appreciate both of you. You did a great job today, provided the audience a lot of questions. And we really appreciate your time and all your effort and the Q&A. So I don't know, is there something you'd like to say before I close out the webcast?
I think, well, the only thing I can think of offhand is we'll answer these questions directly if we've got an email address that we can respond to. We'll go ahead and answer those questions for the ones that we didn't get to today. Other than that, I thank you very much for your time, and if you're interested in our products that help with preventing and recovering from Active Directory disasters, please visit our website at semperis.com.
Great. And the audience, several people in the audience wanted to know about the presentation and if there's a replay. And we do have both, and you'll get an email tomorrow letting you know that the replay is available, and the slides for the presentation will also be in the email. So look for that about this time tomorrow. So with that, I'd like to thank the audience for attending today's webcast, sponsored by Semperis and presented by Redmond Magazine. Thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. This concludes our webcast.